I've been doing groundskeeping at Elmhurst Memorial Cemetery for about 6 years. Before that, I did landscaping for a private company, so the work itself wasn't new to me. Mowing, trimming, maintaining paths, seasonal plantings around the older sections. The only real difference is the setting. And after a few months, that stops registering too. It's just a job. My coworker Pete likes to tell new hires that the residents are the quietest neighbors you'll ever have. And honestly, that's about the size of it. We started doing extended evening hours about 2 years ago. The cemetery administration had contracted with a local veterans organization to install new markers in the older military section. And the crews doing the installation could only come in after 5 p.m. due to their day jobs. So for about 3 months, myself and a guy named Garrett were on site until midnight. Sometimes later, making sure the work crews had access and that the gates were secured once they left. We got a flat overtime bonus for it. Neither of us had a problem with staying late. I want to be clear, I had worked at that cemetery for 4 years at that point. I knew every section, every path, every cluster of trees. I was not nervous about being there after dark. It genuinely did not bother me. The veterans section is in the northeast corner of the grounds, separated from the main cemetery by a gravel path and a row of old oak trees. It's one of the oldest parts of the property. Some of the markers go back to the Civil War, and the ground there is uneven in places where old wooden grave borders have rotted away beneath the surface. During the day, it's actually one of the more peaceful sections. Old trees, well-maintained grass, orderly rows. At night, it feels different, but I always told myself that was just psychology. You're surrounded by headstones in the dark. Of course, your brain starts generating atmosphere. Doesn't mean anything. The first time something felt wrong was a Thursday in early October, around 10:15 p.m. The installation crew had packed up for the night. I'd walked them to the main gate, and Garrett had gone to check the south entrance locks. I was walking back through the veterans section alone, shorter route to the equipment shed, when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me, distinct, unhurried. I turned around, nobody there. The path was empty as far as my flashlight reached. I stood still for a moment and listened. Nothing. I figured it was probably the gravel settling or an animal moving through the oak leaves. I kept walking. The sound didn't come back that night. I mentioned it to Garrett the next day. He shrugged and said the gravel in that section was loose and did weird things sometimes, especially after the temperatures started dropping and the ground shifted. That made enough sense that I let it go. The following Tuesday, around 11 p.m., I was doing a final walkthrough of the veterans section before locking up when my flashlight caught something between two of the older markers in the far row. A small object sitting directly on top of one of the stones. I walked over. It was a photograph, old, black and white, laminated, of a man in a military uniform. Placed neatly on the marker, not weighted down, just sitting there in the still air. The name on the stone was CP Elder Raymond H. Morrow, 1921 to 1944. This wasn't completely unheard of. Families leave things: flowers, flags, photographs, coins on veteran markers. But this photograph had not been there when I walked that row at 6 p.m. I was certain of it because part of my job that evening had been clearing debris off the older markers before the installation crew arrived. I had touched that stone. There was nothing on it at 6 p.m. The crew hadn't been in that row. Their work was 3 sections over. I photographed it with my phone, noted it in the maintenance log, and left it where it was. Family must have come through in the evening, I figured. We didn't always catch every visitor before close. The south entrance had a slow closing latch that people had figured out over the years. What I should have done was mention it to Garrett immediately. Instead, I waited until the next morning, by which point I'd mostly talked myself out of it being anything unusual. That was probably my first mistake. The next Thursday at 11:40 p.m., I was alone in the veterans section again. Garrett had left early, family thing. I'd offered to finish the lockup, and the footsteps came back. This time not on gravel, on grass behind me, maybe 20 feet back. That distinctive compression sound of someone walking on frozen turf. I turned around fast and swept my flashlight in a full arc. Nobody. But this time I noticed something I hadn't the first time. The grass between two of the middle row markers was disturbed, pressed down, the frost broken in a rough shape. Not a path of footprints, more like someone had been standing in one spot for a while. Right there, in the row I had walked through 6 minutes earlier. I called Garrett. He didn't answer. I stood in the middle of the veterans section at 11:43 p.m., trying to decide whether to finish the lockup or walk straight to my truck, and I'm not embarrassed to tell you it was a harder decision than it should have been. I finished the lockup, quickly. I told Garrett the next morning, all of it. The footsteps, the photograph, the disturbed grass. He took it seriously, which I appreciated. We agreed to do the final walkthroughs together for the rest of the contract. 2 nights later, Garrett saw it too. He described it before I said anything. Footsteps on the path when there was nobody visible, stopping when you turned around. He heard it at 10:50 p.m. while I was at the south gate. He radioed me immediately. We went through the administration to pull the visitor log for the evenings in question. The log showed no visitor sign-ins after 7 p.m. on any of the nights I'd heard the footsteps. The south entrance latch issue was flagged and repaired the following week. After the repair, the footsteps stopped. I haven't heard them since. What I think probably happened is that someone, a family member, maybe of CPL Morrow, maybe just someone who visited that section regularly, had been coming in through the south entrance after hours and spending time in the veterans section. When the latch was fixed and after hours access became impossible, they stopped. That's the rational explanation, and it probably covers the footsteps and the photograph both. Except the disturbed grass, that shape in the frost, was in a row I had just walked through. And there's no explanation I've found for how someone could have been standing there 6 minutes after I passed through and still been gone before I turned around. The section is open ground, nowhere to go that my flashlight wouldn't have reached. The installation contract ended in November. I still work at Elmhurst, day shift now, mostly. I don't volunteer for the late lockups anymore, and nobody asks me to. Garrett still does them sometimes. He hasn't mentioned hearing anything again, and I haven't asked. I took a temporary job at Valhaven Garden Cemetery the fall after I finished my associate's degree, mostly because I needed something with flexible hours while I figured out what came next. The position was listed as Evening Maintenance Associate, which turned out to mean I was responsible for locking the gates, doing a final grounds check, and responding to any after-hours maintenance issues. Shift was 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. I was 22. I needed the money, and I genuinely did not think working in a cemetery at night was going to be a problem. The property manager was a quiet, methodical man named Dale who had run the cemetery for over 20 years. He trained me the first week, showed me the gate sequences, walked me through every section. Valhaven is a large property, well over 100 acres, divided into themed sections with names like Garden of Remembrance, Infant Rest, and the older Pioneer section near the back of the grounds. The Pioneer section was the one Dale mentioned specifically during training. He said some of the grave infrastructure back there was old enough to be unstable, sunken plots, deteriorating markers, and I should stay on the paved path if I ever needed to check it after dark. He didn't say anything else about it. I didn't ask. The evening shift was quiet most nights, an occasional late visitor that I'd politely notify before closing, some light tidying, a lot of walking. The grounds are genuinely beautiful in the evening in early autumn before it gets fully cold. I didn't mind it. My coworker on some nights was a part-time guy named Marcus who had been there about 3 years. He was friendly, a little quiet, knew the property well. We'd walk sections together sometimes during overlap hours, and he'd point out the older markers with interesting histories. He seemed to genuinely like the place. Marcus finished his last shift in early October. He gave notice, something about relocating for a girlfriend's job, standard stuff. We shook hands. Dale thanked him. That was that. From mid-October on, I was doing the evening shift solo most nights. About a week after Marcus left, I was doing my 11 p.m. Mark Hillmark Pioneer section check, walking the paved path slowly, flashlight on, nothing unusual. when I saw that someone had left something on the path. A small folding knife, closed, sitting in the middle of the pavement. I picked it up. Plain handle, nothing special. I brought it to the maintenance building and left it on Dale's desk with a note. The next evening, Dale told me it was Marcus's knife, said he recognized it. Marcus had carried it for the whole time he worked there, used it for cutting twine and zip ties. Dale said he'd mail it to him. He seemed mildly puzzled, but not concerned about how it ended up on the path. I should have left it there. That was the end of a perfectly normal explanation. Instead, what I kept thinking about was that I had walked that exact stretch of path at 8 p.m. and the knife wasn't there. It appeared between 8 and 11, and Marcus had been gone for a week, at 12:20 a.m. The following Thursday, I heard someone walking in the Pioneer section. Not on the path, in the section itself, moving through the grass between markers. The sound was careful, deliberate, like someone picking their way through uneven ground, which is exactly what moving through the Pioneer section after dark would feel like, given the sunken plots. I stopped and listened, then called out that the cemetery was closed and they'd need to exit. The footsteps stopped. I swept my flashlight into the Pioneer section from the path. About 3 rows in, the beam passed over something and I moved it back. A figure standing between 2 of the taller Victorian-era monuments, still facing me. I called out again, asked them to come to the path. The figure didn't move. I radioed Dale's emergency line. He'd asked me to call him directly if anything was actually wrong rather than calling general security, who often took 20 minutes to arrive. He answered on the 3rd ring, told me to stay on the path, that he was coming. I kept my flashlight on the figure while I waited. It stayed still, just standing there in the dark between the monuments, looking in my direction. Dale arrived in 11 minutes. We went in together. Nothing there. We swept the entire Pioneer section with 2 flashlights and found no one. The ground in the area where I'd seen the figure showed some disturbance in the frost. Scuff marks, the kind you'd make moving carefully over uneven ground, but nothing conclusive. Dale was quiet on the walk back to the maintenance building. I asked him directly if anything had ever happened in the Pioneer section before. He was quiet for a moment and then said that Marcus had reported something similar about 2 months prior, a figure in the back section, gone before anyone could get close. Marcus had thought it was a trespasser. They'd never identified anyone. He hadn't mentioned this during my training. Dale called the police the next morning and they did a check of the perimeter fencing. Found a section of fencing near the Pioneer section that had been bent outward. Old damage, hard to say how recent. It was repaired. After the repair, I saw nothing in the Pioneer section again. What most likely happened, I've since concluded, is that someone, possibly homeless, possibly someone with a specific interest in that part of the grounds, had been accessing the property through the fence damage and spending time in the Pioneer section at night. Marcus saw them. I saw them. When the fence was fixed, the access point closed. I still can't fully square the knife though. Marcus had been gone for a week. The knife was his. It was on a path I had walked 3 hours before, and it wasn't there then. Dale said he mailed it back to Marcus, but I never confirmed it arrived. I didn't have Marcus's contact information, and I didn't reach out to Dale to follow up. Probably should have. That one still sits with me. I need to preface this by saying I am a deeply practical person. I have a degree in accounting. I coach youth soccer on weekends. I don't watch horror movies, and I don't particularly believe in anything I can't verify. My wife will tell you I'm the least superstitious person she's ever met. I say all this because what I'm about to describe sounds like the kind of thing I would have rolled my eyes at before it happened to me. I was hired by Covenant Hills Cemetery as a temporary night watchman 2 summers ago while their regular security staff was down 2 people. The job was straightforward: 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., walk the grounds every 2 hours, check the gates, document anything unusual. The cemetery is mid-sized, older, in a suburban area of central Indiana. Well-maintained, professional staff during the day. Nothing about the place felt unusual during my first 2 weeks. My contact person at the property was the operations manager, a woman named Sandra. who was on call for anything that required a decision above my pay grade. The only other overnight presence was a groundskeeper named Tim, who worked a split shift. He'd come in around 4 a.m. to start the morning prep before the day crew arrived. So from 10 to 4, I was the only person on the property. I want to be very clear. For the first 2 weeks, nothing happened. I walked the grounds, I checked the gates, I sat in the security cabin with bad coffee and a book. Nothing. The third week, on a Wednesday, I noticed during my 2 a.m. walk that a fresh grave in the eastern section had been disturbed. Not dug up. Nothing that dramatic. The floral arrangements that had been placed on the mound were scattered, like something had moved through them. I photographed it and sent it to Sandra. She said it was probably deer. They were a constant problem in that section, and she'd have Tim look at it in the morning. Fine. Done. On Friday of that same week at 12:47 a.m., I found the same grave disturbed again. Arrangements scattered, same as before. This time I noticed that the small laminated card with the deceased's name, the temporary marker before the permanent stone is placed, had been moved. It had been set to the side of the mound, face down. I genuinely could not explain how deer would selectively move a laminated card and flip it over. I photographed everything and called Sandra immediately, rather than waiting. She came in the next morning and looked at it herself. She was quiet for a moment, then said she'd had the family notified and would review the camera coverage. The eastern section, it turned out, had a camera gap. There was one camera that should have covered it, but had been angled incorrectly for months, essentially pointing at a patch of shrubs. Nobody had caught it during routine reviews. The camera was repositioned that afternoon, and I, against what I now consider my better judgment, agreed to keep doing the overnight alone while they waited to see if it happened again. Sandra offered to get a second watchman. I said I'd be fine. I know. Stupid. The following Tuesday at 1:33 a.m., I was crossing the eastern section on my scheduled walk when I heard something. Very close. A slow, deliberate sound from the direction of that grave. A soft, rhythmic compression, like someone kneeling in soft earth and shifting their weight. I stopped walking. The sound continued for about 4 seconds and then stopped. I stood still for probably 30 seconds, doing a full scan with my flashlight. I saw nothing. The grave looked undisturbed from where I was standing, about 40 feet away. My flashlight wasn't quite reaching the mound fully at that distance. I had two options: walk toward it or stay put and call it in. I walked toward it. I know. The grave was disturbed again. Fresh disturbance this time. The earth of the mound had been padded, pressed down in places in a pattern that did not look random or animal-made. The laminated card was gone entirely. I never found it. I called Sandra, I called the police. I stood exactly where I was until the first patrol car arrived at 1:58 a.m. Officers walked the full property. They found no one. The camera, newly repositioned, had captured the eastern section clearly all night and showed nothing approaching the grave after 10 p.m. Nothing on camera. Sound at 1:33 a.m. Fresh disturbance between my 11 p.m. walk when the grave was undisturbed and 1:33 a.m. The police flagged it as potential vandalism or a family-related disturbance of burial goods. Apparently it happens sometimes. Contested estates or family disputes playing out in unhealthy ways. They followed up with the family. I was never told the outcome of that conversation. I finished my contract the remaining 3 days. I walked those grounds 4 more times and nothing happened. Tim, when I told him about it on his 4 a.m. arrival that Wednesday morning, just nodded slowly and said the eastern section had always been the part of the property he liked least. I asked him why. He thought about it for a moment and said he didn't know exactly, just that it always felt like you were being watched from further in when you were working along the edges. He'd never told anyone that before, he said. Didn't want to sound strange. I don't work overnight security anymore. Not for any dramatic reason. I just decided the accounting work paid better once I picked up a second client, and I didn't need the supplement. That's the honest version. My wife has a slightly different theory about why I started hustling for more daytime clients that fall specifically, and she's not entirely wrong. The thing I think about is the camera. Clean footage. Nothing on it from 10 p.m. to the moment I found the disturbance. I don't have a framework for that. I've tried to build one and I can't.